Getting rich is the easy part. Escaping poverty is much harder. No, you didn't hear that wrong. In this video, I'm going to explain why that's the case in today's world. Most people believe they are poor for a very simple reason. They think they just don't make enough money. They believe the solution is obvious. Work harder, pick up extra hours, save a little more. But what if that isn't the real problem? What if poverty isn't simply a lack of money? What if poverty behaves more like a force of nature, like gravity? Imagine trying to climb out of a deep canyon while the ground beneath your feet keeps pulling you back down. Every step upward costs energy. Every slip sends you sliding back to the bottom. That is what poverty feels like for millions of people. You work harder, you try to save, you get a little bit ahead, and then something happens. The car breaks down, the rent goes up, a medical bill arrives in the mail. Suddenly you are back where you started, sometimes even lower. This is why the hardest problem in economics is not getting rich. Getting rich is actually the easy part. The real challenge is figuring out why so many hardworking people never escape being poor. Today we are going to talk about something I call the physics of poverty, because escaping poverty is not just about effort. It's about reaching something scientists call escape velocity. And just like a rocket leaving Earth, if you don't reach that exact speed, you don't get close to freedom. You fall all the way back down. Today we're going to break down the invisible forces that keep millions of people trapped in this gravity well. And more importantly, how to finally escape it. And this is the part most people never talk about. When most people hear the word poverty, they imagine a number, a small number in a bank account, a low paycheck, an empty wallet. But poverty is not just a number. Poverty behaves more like a system with rules, a system with pressure, a system with forces constantly pushing you in a specific direction. That's why I call it the physics of poverty. In physics, every object is influenced by forces. Gravity pulls things down. Friction slows them down. Momentum pushes them forward. Your financial life works in a very similar way. When you are wealthy, many of those forces push you forward. Your savings protect you from emergencies. Your investments grow while you sleep. Your network opens new opportunities. Small advantages begin to compound. But when you are poor, the forces move in the opposite direction. Every mistake costs more. Every emergency hits harder. Every setback pushes you further down. Instead of momentum pushing you upward, you experience constant drag. And this creates something extremely powerful, a loop. Low income creates stress. Stress leads to short-term decisions. Short-term decisions prevent long-term assets. Without assets, income stays low. And the cycle begins again, round and round. Economists sometimes call this a poverty trap, but trap might actually be too gentle of a word, because a trap sounds like something you accidentally fall into once. What we are dealing with is more like a gravitational field. Once you are inside it, everything becomes harder. Climbing out requires far more energy than people on the outside realize, and this is why advice like just work harder often fails. Hard work inside the gravity well does not guarantee escape. You can push with everything you have and still slide back down. If you truly want to understand poverty, you have to stop thinking like an accountant and start thinking like a physicist. Because escaping poverty is not about a single decision. It's about overcoming a set of invisible forces that are constantly pulling you back to the ground. And in the next part, we are going to look at the first of those forces, the one that quietly drains your energy before you even realize it. I call it the scarcity tax. But here's where the story gets interesting. If poverty behaves like gravity, then the next question becomes obvious. What exactly creates that gravitational pull? Why do so many people push upward with all their strength and still end up sliding back down? The answer is that poverty is not held in place by a single problem. It is held together by a network of reinforcing loops. Think of them as chains. Each chain alone is heavy, but together they form a cage. In my experience, There are 5 specific loops that keep people trapped in the gravity of poverty. 5 forces that quietly push people back down every time they try to climb out. The first is what I call the scarcity tax. When you have very little money, every small problem becomes a crisis. A broken phone, a medical bill, a missed paycheck, suddenly your entire life is in emergency mode. That stress doesn't just hurt your wallet. It hurts your ability to think clearly. When your mind is constantly focused on survival, you stop planning for the future. You stop thinking about next year. Your brain shrinks its timeline to the next few hours or the next few days. And when your cognitive bandwidth is limited, the decisions you make become short-term decisions. That's the first loop. The second loop is far more emotional. I call it the dopamine trap. When life feels stressful, unfair, or exhausting, the brain begins to search for small moments of relief. Buying something new, eating out, upgrading a phone, purchasing something that signals success. For a few minutes, the brain releases dopamine. The stress fades. You feel like you've won, but the relief is temporary and the financial cost is permanent. Over time, those small moments of emotional spending slowly drain the very resources that could have created long-term stability. The third loop is structural. This is the linear income trap. Most people are taught a simple formula. If you want more money, work more hours. The problem is that time is limited. You only have 24 hours in a day. You need sleep. You need rest. That means your income has a hard ceiling, but your expenses do not. As prices rise, as inflation eats away at purchasing power, the gap between effort and progress becomes wider. You can run faster and faster, yet feel like you are moving nowhere. The fourth loop is something most people rarely notice. I call it social gravity. Human beings naturally absorb the beliefs and behaviors of the people around them. If everyone in your environment believes success is impossible, that belief spreads. If the people around you normalize debt, complaining, or financial chaos, those patterns become familiar. Not because anyone is evil, but because humans are wired to imitate the tribe. Over time, the environment itself becomes a powerful force holding people in place. And finally, there is the fifth loop, the most mathematical one. I call it the compound void. While wealthy individuals benefit from compound growth investments, businesses, and appreciating assets, many people trapped in poverty experience the opposite. Compound interest working against them. Credit card balances grow. Loans accumulate interest. Fees stack on top of fees. Instead of money quietly multiplying in the background, debt quietly multiplies. Every month becomes slightly heavier than the last. When all 5 of these loops combine, the scarcity tax, the dopamine trap, the linear income trap, social gravity, and the compound void, they create something incredibly powerful. A self-reinforcing system, a system that keeps pulling people back toward the same financial position, no matter how hard they try to climb. But once you understand these loops, something important changes, because what looks like a random struggle suddenly begins to look like a pattern, and patterns can be broken. In the next part, we are going to examine the first loop more closely, the one that silently drains your mental energy every single day. The force is known as the scarcity tax. Keep watching, because the next idea might be the most important one in this entire video. Now we arrive at the fourth force, and this one might be the most dangerous of all, because unlike debt or income or expenses, you can't see it on a bank statement. It lives in your environment. I call it social gravity. Let me ask you a simple question. If you spent the next 5 years surrounded only by world-class athletes, what would happen to your fitness? You would start exercising more. You would eat better. You would think differently about discipline. Not because someone forced you, but because humans are imitation machines. Deep inside your brain are cells called mirror neurons. They constantly scan the people around you and quietly copy their behavior. Their habits become your habits. Their beliefs become your beliefs. Now think about what happens if the opposite environment surrounds you. Imagine a group of friends who constantly say things like, "Money is impossible to make. The system is rigged. Rich people are just lucky. Why even try?" At first it sounds harmless, just conversation, just frustration. But the human brain is incredibly sensitive to repetition. When you hear the same belief enough times, your brain slowly accepts it as reality, and that is how social gravity begins to work. There is a famous metaphor that explains this perfectly. It's called the crab bucket effect. If you place a single crab inside a bucket, it can eventually crawl out. But if you place 10 crabs in the same bucket, something strange happens. Every time one crab tries to climb out, the others grab its legs and pull it back down. Not because they are evil, but because movement toward escape creates tension inside the group, and humans behave the same way. The moment you start changing your behavior, people notice. You stop spending money the way you used to. You start reading books. You stop going out every weekend. You begin saving instead of consuming. And suddenly the people around you become uncomfortable. They might laugh. "Why are you acting like that?" They might criticize, "You think you're better than us now?" Or they might try to normalize the old behavior. Relax. Life is short. What they are really saying is something much deeper. Your change threatens the story they tell themselves about their own lives. Because if you escape, then escape was always possible. And that realization can be painful. So the easiest solution for the group is to pull you back into the bucket. This is social gravity, not hatred, not sabotage, just unconscious pressure to stay the same. And if you don't recognize it, this force can quietly destroy your progress, because you cannot climb upward while being surrounded by people who celebrate staying stuck. So how do you break this force? The answer is not cruelty. You don't have to abandon your family. You don't have to insult your friends. But you must protect your mental environment. You must become extremely careful about whose voices dominate your mind. The good news is that we live in a time where geography no longer controls your tribe. You may not live next door to successful entrepreneurs, but you can still spend time with some of the greatest thinkers in history. Through books, through interviews, through lectures. You can learn from people like Charlie Munger. You can explore the ideas of thinkers like Albert Einstein. Every book you read is a conversation across time. Every biography you study is a download of someone else's operating system. Slowly, your mental circle begins to change. And once your environment changes, your expectations change. What once felt impossible begins to feel normal. And when that shift happens, social gravity starts working in your favor instead of against you. But there is still one final force left. One that quietly determines whether money grows for you or grows against you. And that force is the power of compounding. Stay with me, because the next part explains why most people never escape this cycle. Now we arrive at the fifth and final force. And unlike the others, this one is not emotional. It is not social. It is purely mathematical. And mathematics does not care about your intentions. It does not care how hard you work. It does not care how good your heart is. It simply follows its own rules. I call this force the compound void. You may have heard the famous quote often attributed to Albert Einstein. Compound interest is the eighth wonder of the world. He who understands it earns it. He who doesn't pays it. At first, that sounds like a clever sentence, but in reality, it describes one of the most powerful dividing lines in the entire financial system, because there are only two kinds of people in the world when it comes to compounding: those who receive it and those who pay it. Let's make this painfully clear with a simple example. Imagine two people waking up on the same morning. Both of them have $0 in their wallet, but their financial systems are completely different. The first person owes $10,000 on a credit card with 20% interest. The second person has $10,000 invested in a broad market fund like the S&P 500. Neither person spends a single dollar that day. They both go to work. They both come home. They both go to sleep. But something invisible happens while they sleep. The first person's debt grows. The second person's investment grows. The next morning, one of them wakes up slightly poorer. The other wakes up slightly richer. And here is the terrifying part. The difference starts small, almost invisible. But compounding is not linear. It is exponential, which means the longer it runs, the faster it accelerates. Think of it like a snowball rolling down a mountain. At the very beginning, it looks harmless, just a tiny ball of snow. But with every rotation, it gathers more snow. It becomes heavier. It moves faster. Eventually, it becomes an avalanche. This is exactly how wealth works for people who own assets. But for people trapped in debt, the snowball rolls in the opposite direction. Instead of gathering wealth, it gathers interest payments, credit cards, car loans, student loans, fees, penalties. Each month adds another layer. And slowly, something strange begins to happen. Your effort stops being enough to outrun the math. You can work harder. You can take extra shifts, but the interest continues growing quietly in the background. Like a current pulling against your boat, you row harder, but the river never stops flowing. This is the compound void, the empty space where wealth should have been growing, but instead debt has been multiplying. And the longer someone stays on the wrong side of compounding, the harder escape becomes. Because time is the most powerful multiplier in the entire equation. A small investment started early can grow into something enormous, but a small debt ignored for years can become equally devastating. The tragedy is that many people spend the first half of their lives unknowingly feeding the wrong side of the equation. They are paying for compounding while someone else is earning it, but the moment you cross that line, everything begins to change. Even small numbers start working for you. $10 a day invested consistently, $50 a week, a few $100s a month. At first, it feels insignificant, almost pointless, but compounding rewards patience in a way that almost nothing else in life does, because time quietly turns consistency into power. And once that snowball starts rolling in your direction, the same force that once worked against you begins pulling you forward instead. This is where everything flips, and what happens next is the moment where the entire system becomes clear. Now that we've seen the 5 forces that keep people trapped in the gravity of poverty, a new question appears. If these forces are so powerful, how does anyone ever escape? Because clearly, some people do. Some people start with very little and still manage to break orbit. The reason is simple. Escaping poverty is not a single moment. It is a sequence, just like a rocket launch. A rocket does not jump straight from the ground to the moon. It goes through stages. First, ignition, then acceleration, then orbit. Your financial life follows the same pattern. There are 3 stages of escape, and skipping one of them is the reason many people fail. The first stage is survival. This is the stage where you stop the bleeding, not grow wealth, not invest, not chase big opportunities, just stop the damage. Many people try to skip this step because it feels small and boring, but without it, everything else collapses. Imagine someone who earns $3,000 a month but owes $8,000 on a credit card charging 22% interest. Every month, hundreds of dollars disappear just to service the debt. That person is trying to run forward while a rope tied to their waist pulls them backward. The first mission is simple. Cut expenses. Sell unnecessary possessions. Work temporarily harder if necessary. And destroy the highest interest debt first. This is not glamorous work, but it is essential because until the bleeding stops, wealth cannot grow. A famous real-world example of this stage comes from the early life of Dave Ramsey. In his 20s, he built a small real estate portfolio and looked wealthy on paper. But when banks suddenly called in his loans, he found himself buried under millions of dollars in debt. He lost almost everything. The first thing he did was not invest. It was survival. He sold assets, cut expenses, and focused entirely on eliminating debt. Only after stabilizing did he begin rebuilding. That leads to the second stage, accumulation. This is where the direction of compounding finally begins to change. At this stage, you start acquiring small assets. And the key word here is small. Many people believe investing requires large amounts of money, but compounding cares far more about time than size. Imagine two workers. The first waits until age 40 to begin investing $500 a month. The second starts at age 25 with just $100 a month. Even though the second person contributes far less money overall, the earlier start often results in greater wealth by retirement. Why? Because time did most of the work. This is why many long-term investors focus on broad market funds such as the S&P 500. Instead of trying to predict the next winning stock, they simply buy a tiny piece of the entire economy and let time compound the growth. A real example of the power of this approach is Ronald Read. He worked as a gas station attendant and later as a janitor in a small town. His salary was modest for most of his life, but he quietly invested small amounts in stocks for decades. When he passed away, people were shocked to learn he had accumulated over $8 million, not through luck, not through inheritance, but through consistency and time. And finally, we reach the third stage, freedom. This is the moment when your assets begin generating enough income to support your basic life. Not luxury, not yachts, just freedom from survival pressure. Imagine someone whose basic living expenses are $2,000 a month. If their investments, business income, or rental property begin producing that same $2,000 each month, something extraordinary happens. For the first time in their life, survival is no longer tied directly to selling hours of labor. They can choose their work. They can walk away from toxic environments. They can take time to think, learn, and build. This is what economists sometimes call financial independence. And when this point arrives, the gravitational pull that once held you down begins to weaken dramatically because your time is no longer fully owned by survival. Now your energy can be directed toward growth, toward creativity, toward opportunity. In rocket science, the moment a spacecraft reaches escape velocity, Earth's gravity no longer dominates its movement. It enters orbit. In financial life, this moment feels remarkably similar. The pressure eases, the noise quiets, and for the first time, you realize you are no longer trying to survive. You are finally free to choose where you want to go next. Before we end, step back for a moment and look at the entire system we've uncovered. Poverty is not a single mistake. It is not laziness. It is not a lack of intelligence. It is a set of forces working together. The scarcity tax drains your mental energy. The dopamine trap turns pain into impulsive spending. The linear income trap caps your progress. Social gravity pulls you back toward the habits of your environment. And the compound void quietly multiplies the wrong side of the equation. 5 forces, 5 chains. And when they operate together, they create something that feels almost impossible to escape. That is why so many hardworking people feel like they are running as fast as they can, yet somehow staying in the same place. But here is the truth most people never hear. These forces are powerful, but they are not invincible, because while the system may shape the battlefield, your behavior determines the direction of the fight. Every dollar you save weakens the scarcity tax. Every impulse you resist breaks the dopamine trap. Every skill you build pushes you beyond the limits of linear income. Every new idea you absorb weakens the pull of social gravity. And every asset you own moves you closer to the right side of compounding. Escape does not happen in a single heroic moment. It happens in thousands of small decisions, quiet decisions, uncomfortable decisions, the kind that no one applauds while you are making them. Saving when others are spending, studying when others are scrolling, building when others are complaining. Those small decisions may feel invisible at first, but over time they build something incredibly powerful: momentum. And momentum is the one force strong enough to overcome gravity. Remember the rocket we talked about in the beginning. When it sits on the launch pad, gravity is winning. The rocket looks heavy, immovable. But once the engines ignite, once enough force builds, the same gravity that once held it down can no longer stop it. Your life works the same way. Right now, you might feel like you are standing at the bottom of the gravity well, but the laws of escape have not changed. The path still exists. Build the buffer. Control the dopamine. Stack the skills. Choose your environment. Own assets that compound. Piece by piece, those actions build the fuel required for escape velocity. And one day, something subtle but profound will happen. The pressure will lift. The ground that once pulled you down will lose its grip. And you will realize that the cage you thought was locked was never locked at all. The door has always been open. The only question left is this: will you keep walking in circles inside the gravity well, or will you light the engines and leave it behind?